The ECB and the Swiss National Bank cut rates overnight. US producer price inflation is hotter than expected, at least in the headline. Australia's jobs market tightens as unemployment falls. And India's inflation rate of 5.5% meets forecasts, leaving the way clear for a rate cut in February. That's coming up in our 5 Things in 5 Minutes. And then in our bonus deep dive interview, as we start thinking about what to put on the table on Christmas Day, ANZ's Executive Director for Agribusiness Insights, Michael Whitehead, reveals recent trends in what Australians eat and drink on the big day.
The Sydney seafood market, who run a 36-hour non-stop Christmas marathon leading up until Christmas itself, up until the afternoon of Christmas Eve. They've done some really good research on when the biggest times are for people to go and buy their seafood, and particularly their prawns.
But first, in 5 and 5 with ANZ, the European Central Bank cut its benchmark deposit rate overnight by 25 basis points to 3%, as expected. ANZ head of G3 Economics, Brian Martin, says the ECB had to lower its growth and inflation forecast too, and is set to cut by another 150 basis points in the first half of next year.
So it looks very much as if the growth inflation mix is one that's going to be consistent with a sustained disinflation, taking inflation to target. Now, we think the risks are that the ECB will have to cut interest rates below neutral. We've got a forecast that the deposit rate will be cut to 1.5% by late summer next year. We think that will put policy into stimulatory territory. We think that's necessary to support the growth outlook, and in turn that is necessary to support the inflation outlook.
Number 2, US producer price inflation data for November out overnight showed a rise of 0.4% on a headline basis from October, and the annual rate rose to 3% from 2.4%. That was higher than market expectations for a headline rate of 2.6%. But Brian says the core CPI inflation figures were more in line with forecasts, with a 50% rise in egg prices last month because of bird flu being a big factor in faster food price inflation.
When you put the PPI and the CPI data together, they are pointing to a reasonably well-behaved PCE deflator report for this month, I think in the region of 0.2%. And that, I think, will underscore the Fed's confidence, because they'll be able to calculate this quicker than it is released, I would have thought, or at least get a very good proxy for what it will be. I think that would give them confidence to go ahead with cutting interest rates.
That hotter headline number pushed up US 10-year Treasury bond yields by 3 basis points as of 4 a.m. Sydney-Melbourne time. That saw US stocks fall around 0.2 to 0.3%. The 2-year Treasury yield was flat. The US dollar index fell 0.1% overnight, while the Aussie dollar rose 0.3% to 63.9 US cents. And the Kiwi was up 0.1% at 57.91 US cents. One surprise, the Swiss National Bank cut its main policy rate in half to 0.5%, its biggest cut in 10 years and more than expected. So the US dollar rose 0.4% against the Swiss franc to 0.8883 francs to the dollar. Number 3, Australia's unemployment rate dipped below 4% in November for the first time since March, hitting 3.9%. ANZ senior economist Adelaide Timbrell says a range of measures showed the labour market tightening.
Combined with a fall in the underemployment rate to 6.1%, we saw the lowest underutilisation rate since September 2023. Employment growth bounced in November, 35.6 thousand, after weak revised October growth of 12.1 thousand. Participation ticked down to 67% from 67.1%, but it has printed within this range for the last 5 months. The unexpected drop in the employment rate came from more than expected employment growth, as well as that touchdown in the participation rate.
Number 4, the tightening labour market will have caught the Reserve Bank of Australia's attention after it softened its view on inflation over the last week.
When we think about how this affects the Reserve Bank and the timing of the first rate cut, it mostly offsets some of the dovishness we saw in response to the softer than expected GDP growth last week, as well as that dovish step in the post-meeting statement in December. Our preferred measure of labour market tightness, the full-time equivalent employment population ratio, still remains at levels consistent with inflation ultimately returning to the Reserve Bank's target band.
Number 5. India's annual inflation rate fell to 5.5% in November from 6.2% in October, largely due to lower vegetable prices because of the weather. That was in line with expectations, and ANZ India economist Diraj Nim sees the Reserve Bank of India still on track to cut in February.
We continue to believe that underlying inflation in the economy remains quite conducive to embark upon monetary policy easing, especially as growth is giving clear signals of slowdown. So we are maintaining our call of a February rate cut, a total of 3 rate cuts with risks of more if the economic slack weakens.
Diraj Nim there. Now, in our bonus deep dive interview, ANZ's Executive Director for Agribusiness Insights, Michael Whitehead, investigates what Australians like to eat and drink on Christmas Day. A health warning for listeners, prawns are mentioned in this interview.
Christmas is such an important time of year for so many food, beverage and agri companies too. The companies that are producing for what everybody is going to eat and what they're going to drink. And it is the biggest time of year for just about all of them in so many ways. They've got to start planning months out for what everyone is going to eat and not too little of it so we don't run out, not too much so there's not too much left over, how to cart it, how to store it just at the right temperature, and when to get it onto the shelves so all of us out there will come in and buy it at the right time so it's ready and fresh on the Christmas tables.
And tell us, what do people in Australia eat on Christmas Day to start with?
Well, it's a fascinating mix between what we traditionally eat and what we eat because of our summer Christmases. So we still eat a lot of turkey. Even though it's a very hot place here, about 3/4 of all the turkey consumption in Australia happens on Christmas Day. So there's an awful lot of them sold. And we still eat an awful lot of hams. One of the big supermarkets here says that they sell around 2 million kilos just of the half-leg hams. So there's some of the traditional things we eat. But we are big seafood eaters as well. And there's a huge amount of prawns. It seems to be they've always been one of the biggest things sold at Christmas time. So prawns see a 30% spike or a third up on the rest of the year just for Christmas as well. So they are some of the really big foods that we have.
I suppose in Australia, the prawn on the barbie is a big thing for Christmas Day.
Well, a lot of us Aussies would say that perhaps ever since Paul Hogan did that on the American ads, maybe not so much on the barbie, perhaps cold and peeled on that big platter which goes out on your giant Christmas table. But the prawns are a really interesting one because Australians will time when they buy their prawns to make sure they are as fresh as possible for when they're going out on the table. They probably will cost a bit more, but you trade that off for freshness as well. And it's interesting to look at something like the Sydney Seafood Market, who run a 36-hour non-stop Christmas marathon leading up until Christmas itself, up until the afternoon of Christmas Eve. They've done some really good research on when the biggest times are for people to go and buy their seafood, and particularly their prawns. And it's interesting the amount of people who are going out close to midnight on the 23rd so they can get them, put them in the fridge, then work all day on the 24th to get things ready, or even first thing in the morning on Christmas Eve at about 6, 7 a.m. once again so they can get it and spend the whole day working. It shows us just how much work so many Aussie families put into their Christmas lunches to make sure everything works on the big day.
And the other thing that's consumed is alcohol. What's been happening with alcohol sales, not just through the year, but through the years?
Well, through the years, it is interesting to look at the trends, but then also to forecast what the trends may be going forward. On its own, Australians spend more on alcohol, 60% more on alcohol in December than they do in the average month. Now, we look at a few reasons for this. The first one is how much is being bought to be drunk around the Christmas table on Christmas Day. I mean, everybody has a jolly time. The second one is those Christmas parties leading up to it. But the third big factor is gifts. And it's interesting to see some studies showing that beverages have, for men, become the third most popular present. Interestingly, for women, the fifth most popular one. So a lot of them going under the tree, perhaps because people want less stuff, but you usually know that a bottle of something will get used and will get consumed. So we did see a trend where the alcohol sales over December were going up and going up.
Michael Whitehead there. I'm Bernard Hickey and I don't eat prawns. That was 5 and 5 with ANZ for Friday, December the 13th. We'll be running a short week next week through to Wednesday before we take a Christmas break. Catch you on Monday, though, as we look ahead to the year-end rate decisions from the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England. This podcast contains general information only, not investment advice. You should obtain advice for your personal circumstances before making any investment decisions. Please view the podcast disclaimer available via your media player or email.